Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev is now in Beijing for a visit. This is the first time high-level official visit to China since the conclusion of the 19th CPC National Congress, when the new CPC leadership was elected. China and Russia enjoyed high-level political trust as well as strengthened cooperation in trade and the military. Dmitry Medvedev's visit this time is sure to further enhance ties between the two countries.
Now, Chinese President Xi Jinping has met the visiting Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev in Beijing. President Xi emphasized that Russia is China's biggest strategic cooperation partner and that China is determined to deepen their bilateral relationship. Xi pointed out that both sides should make good use of the regular meeting mechanism between the Chinese Premier and the Russian Prime Minister and enhance cooperation in energy, manufacturing, agriculture and space exploration. Medvedev said the grant blueprint presented by the 19th CPC National Congress was significant to both China and the whole world. And he added that Russia was encouraged by the progress that was made after President Xi's visit to Moscow in July and hoped to further strengthen their cooperation in all fields. Meantime, Premier Keqiang talked with Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev in Beijing on Wednesday morning for a regular meeting between Chinese Premier and Russian Prime Minister. They witnessed the signing of over a dozen agreements and met the press together.
For more on China-Russia ties, we have in our Beijing studio Cui Hongjian, who is the Director of the Department of European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. Meanwhile, joining us in Moscow in Russia, Mr. Dmitry Babich, political analyst from Sputnik International news agency. Welcome as well. Mr. Babich, this is the first Mr. Medvedev's visit to China. Foreign leader visiting China after the CPC 19th National Congress. This is also right before the Chinese President Xi Jinping going to meet the U.S. President Donald Trump. So, quite an interesting time.
You are quite right. I think it's an interesting time. And I think what we see is basically Russia and China getting closer together. Not so much because we love each other so much, even though there is, of course, a lot of sympathy between our two countries. We are kind of forced to get closer to each other by some very unwise policies of the United States and of the European Union. I mean, the provocations against China in the South China Sea, the open support by the former President Obama for all the anti-Chinese sentiments in the countries like the Philippines, like Japan, Vietnam. Unfortunately, these things coincided in time with some very belligerent policy of the United States and the European Union and NATO towards Russia. So in this situation, it is simply necessary for our two countries to get closer. There is a good example. If you look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, the only two countries that were not included were Russia and China, which is like talking about Africa without mentioning the elephant and the lion.
But Mr. Babich, you also understand the 19th Party Congress from China decided we need to create global community of shared future, not just with Russia, but also with many other players, probably with the United States as well. So how does Russia think about that?
The point is that China and Russia were not afraid of globalization. China is not afraid because it is such a powerful economy, and Russia is not afraid because we are basically ruled by economic liberals. If you look at the economic team running Russia, if you look at the chairman of the central bank, at the finance ministry, these are people who believe in global competition and in the benefits of global competition, even though Russia is, of course, much worse positioned for competition than China. So both China and Russia were not afraid of globalization, but the point is, what kind of globalization? If you look at the recent Gallup polls, for example, we see that there are countries that want to get globalized together with the United States and with the European Union, and there are countries that want to get globalized together with China, with Russia, possibly with India and Brazil. So basically, you already have two globalizations. It was not, you know, a result of some, you know, of some bad blood, of some kind of revenge feelings from Russia or from China. The United States deliberately doesn't include us.
What do you make of the so-called two versions of globalization advocated by Mr. Babich? Do you think, from China's perspective, you would agree with that?
To some degree, I agree with that, because I think there will not be any, conflict between China, Russia, cooperation, and also the, the requirement from China. How about to build up, a common community for shared the future? Because as we know, in the past years...
You think there are two versions of globalization that is taking place?
What I want to say to find out some synergies behind those two, maybe a vision of globalization. One of them is undoubtedly China-Russia cooperation could give a very, very robust, basis for this enlarged, vision for more globalization and for more stability for the international community. Because I think it itself, China-Russia's cooperation become a very, very big showcase for how could the big players, big countries could get along with well. I think it also become a example or a model for other major players in the international arena, even for China, US, for Russia, US in future. Why not? We can learn something from the very, very useful experience of China-Russia relations.
But people are asking whether there are competing mechanisms being created by China, Russia, and some of the other countries vis-a-vis, let's just say, the existing one. For example, you all understand there's the UN, there's the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and things like that. And now China, Russia want to create interbank transfer system. It also wants to create a joint credit agency. Of course, the new development bank by the BRICS countries, the emerging economies already there. So people are wondering whether that list will go on and on. What would that mean vis-a-vis the already existing system, Mr. Cui?
Yeah, I don't think there is a kind of natural, competition between these emerging institutions or mechanisms created by China, Russia, or some other emerging economies, and also this existed, powers mechanisms. I think that there will be a kind of benign and complementary relations, because as we know, why there are some requirements from markets, from development for this emerging mechanism, which means that still there are some problem for existed order, for existed mechanism. So hopefully, I think that it will be a very, very good relations in future. But of course, how could try to find a new way to get along with this existing mechanism? It will be a big test for China and Russia.
Of course, it will be a big test, and there will be a big test too for China-Russia bilaterally. Mr. Babich, earlier China and Russia did have agreements on, for example, natural resources cooperation, but many of them did not come into being, and because certain reasons. And now you have another big price tag thing, $400 billion a gas pipeline from Siberia to Northeast Asia, Northeast China rather, and from the western Siberia to China's Xinjiang, which is northwest. So people are wondering, beautiful price tags, big projects, everybody's eye is on them, yet the question is, in the long term, will that be implemented, Mr. Babich?
Well, I think in the long term it will be implemented, simply because there is huge potential in the Eurasian cooperation in general, not just between Russia and China, but also between Russia, China, and the Central Asian countries, and India. We're all living on the one big continent, Eurasia, and it gives a lot of opportunities. If we follow just one model of globalization centered on the United States, it's not going to be good, just like any monopoly, because one globalization for the whole world is a monopoly. So maybe it was a God's blessing for us that basically the United States and the EU have got such incompetent leaderships that they basically ruined the dream of one globalization for all. I can give you an example. For example, the United States and the EU, they don't notice the Eurasian Economic Union, which Russia, under Mr. Putin, proposed to countries like Kazakhstan and Belarus, and they accepted this proposal. But China doesn't have such a prejudice. So China signed agreements with the Eurasian Economic Union, and I think these agreements make sense because these countries, Kazakhstan and Russia, Central Asian countries, Russian is spoken everywhere. They have been part of the same country not even for centuries but for thousands of years. Since the times of Genghis Khan, this was a customs-free area. So not to use this potential is simply stupid, you know, it's a waste of resources.
Well, China, as you may know,
I'm sure that the projects that China and Russia have, they may have problems, but they will be implemented simply because the benefits are going to be so huge.
Well, it has been huge for quite some time, but we'll see whether it will be wonderfully implemented. Mr. Cui, on the other hand, between this China and Russia, there are different ideas flying around. As we mentioned many times earlier, there's the Eurasian corridor proposed by Russia, and also Belt and Road initiatives proposed by China and some of the other partners. And they coincide in some areas of the world. So what would that mean to China? Will people's attention being distracted, or actually there will be more consensus from the two sides to work on real projects? Mr. Cui.
Yes, I think that now it's become a very big issue between China and Russia, how to get more synergies between, you know, these development strategies from both two sides. We can find out that China and Russia, because we enjoyed this kind of very, very high mutual trust. So far it has a very smooth and successful cooperation in the Eurasian Economic Union and the Belt and Road Initiative. Not only on the political level, both two countries, especially the leaders, they signed a joint statement to show a very, very high political trust from each other, and also at the same time there are already some, I think, very, very big projects, like you mentioned before. I think it also give a very, very strong support to this kind of synergy between different, maybe from both two sides, from between those two strategic development.
On the other hand, there's another test between the two countries, that is the issue of the DPRK nuclear issue. Mr. Babich, now the crisis is going ever to more intensity as we speak, and certainly the U.S. President Donald Trump's visit to China is to even pressure China even more about that issue. How is China and Russia in the right way coordinate with one another before that trip and also for the way forward? Mr. Babich.
Well, if you look at the latest statements, Russia and China basically look eye to eye on the North Korean nuclear problem. We joined the United Nations Security Council sanctions against North Korea, despite our history of close ties to this country, simply because Russia and China are responsible neighbors of North Korea. Mr. Trump can talk about fire, fury, wars, destruction. For Russia and for China, a war on the Korean Peninsula is simply not an option. This is unacceptable. So what Russia and China are trying to do is we're going to fight against nuclear proliferation. We're going to put pressure on the North Korean regime, but we simply exclude the option of war. You know, Mr. Obama liked to use this phrase, I keep all the options on the table. Well, if you rightly understand his language, it was actually a threat of war. Let me remind you that a threat of war is prohibited by the UN Charter. The UN Charter not only prohibits wars, it prohibits also the threat of war. So I think that Russia and China see eye to eye on the North Korean problem. Now we can set this problem right, I think, by common efforts. But you can only do it together. Russia, China, the United States, Japan, South Korea. But we should all unite on the platform that war is not an option in Korea.
War is not an option, and yet how is that likely to be prevented? And also, nuclear threat is a big danger too. It is even more probably than a quote-unquote a conflict at small scale. Mr. Cui, what do you think is China's option? Working with Russia, what can China achieve. Meanwhile, will Russia be able to put pressure more on DPRK and not let China to act along in that regard?
Yeah, also, the attitude or stance of China on this DPRK nuclear issue is so as clear as possible. Firstly, nuclearization in the peninsula. Secondly, must be in a peaceful solution. So I think that once every stakeholders, including Russia, United States, Japan, some other, once they follow these two principles, I think every stakeholder could be a partner of China to deal with this any kind of challenges from nuclear issue in Korea Peninsula.
I did not hear very clearly as to how China and Russia could cooperate, besides of the fact that the two do not agree there should be any armed conflict, not even, of course, the war that should be happening in this region. Mr. Babich, can you be more specific? What kind of cooperation can these two countries have, as specific as possible?
I can. Well, first, a dialogue should restart between South Korea and North Korea, between the United States and North Korea. Actually, it is Washington that refuses to have negotiations. It's not Pyongyang. Pyongyang says, talk to us. Washington, in response, says that you are not worthy of talking to us.
Okay.
You are a pariah nation. You are a rogue nation. So this kind of language should stop. Whatever we think about the North Korean leadership, I think China and Russia, were not very enthusiastic. We rejected the model that exists in Pyongyang right now. But it doesn't mean that you can't talk to Pyongyang, especially when such issues as nuclear security are at stake. If you talk to the North Korean regime, then you can explain to them what kind of pressure Russia and China are prepared to exert on North Korea if it continues down the dangerous path. And we can explain to them what kind of benefits they can get if they scale down their nuclear program and if they start to cooperate. If Russia and China see eye to eye, if we agree on joint plan of action, I'm sure that sooner or later the United States and Japan will join us in our joint efforts at bringing peace to the Korean Peninsula.
I see. As we all know, the APEC Economic Forum is to be held very soon in Vietnam this year. And all the countries, leaders of these countries that we mentioned earlier, possibly except the DPRK, are going to be there. So this is likely to be a beautiful multilateral occasion for many of the issues to be discussed. Having said that, though, there's one issue about the United States that seems to be popping up in both of your conversations. That is, what is likely to be your relationship, China's relationship with the United States, Russia's relationship with the United States, and therefore influencing the bilateral relationship between China and Russia. Mr. Babich, very briefly, if you can, sir, very briefly, you knew about the news that is going on right now. The campaign manager of Donald Trump, when he was working as a candidate, has been indicted, and that has a lot to do with what some of the Americans believe as behind-the-scenes meddling of Russia in the U.S. election system. So at this point, this is quite a sensitive time, one would say. Mr. Babich.
Well, I would say that relations between China and the United States, relations between Russia and the United States, they will all depend on the developments inside the United States itself. Because Russia and China are stable countries right now. We are predictable countries with predictable leaderships. We have mechanisms of getting our government younger and more efficient. You know, we are not the China of the 70s or the Soviet Union of Stalin's times. Unfortunately, the United States is unstable, and we see an ongoing political struggle. There are circles in the United States that have never reconciled themselves to the victory of Donald Trump at the election. And what you mentioned, you know, this whole story with so-called Russian meddling in the U.S. election is just a reflection of this political crisis.
Mr. Cui, what about you? What do you make of the sensitive time it seems to be at this point about the legitimacy of a president and as a result of bilateral relations that we are talking about today?
Yes, undoubtedly this kind of a trilateral relations between China, Russia and the United States, I think it become a very, very decisive factor for this stability, for the international community, for global issues. So now, yes, there will be some more interruption from American, domestic politics to its foreign policy, firstly, and then to the global stability. So, but I think now the China and Russia's cooperation played a more important role to help this global stability. And also, I agree with Russia's friends' real points that China and Russia, we do enjoy stability internally. So that's a good time and also an important time for China and Russia. How could we work together to transfer some more, internal stability for more contribution to the world for its, certainty?
I see. I want to thank both of you, gentlemen, for being with us, helping us understand the reality and the possible potential between China and Russia, despite all of the things going on around us. Dmitry Babich, coming from Russia, and Cui Hongjian from China. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, still to come on our program.